Welcome to another episode of the Expat Focus podcast. I'm your host, Carly, an Australian living in France, and today we're talking schooling options in the UK and what expat families can expect. My guest is Steve Spriggs, the Head of Education at William Clarence Education. They advise and consult with families from around the world on British schools and universities. So which schools are right for your children, factoring in not just their interests and your needs as a family, but also where you all might be in 5 years' time? Listen on to find out, and if you have any questions for Steve, you can post them in the Expat Focus UK forum or Facebook group. Steve, what's the typical profile of an expat family that your company works with?
There's not really any typical family, just purely because every family that moves into the UK and actually around Europe has got their own niche, their own story behind their move, whether it's family reasons or personal issues. But I guess they broadly fit into a few distinct categories of either British expats moving back to the UK after a stint abroad, work-related or families, or there's one expat and they've met a partner abroad, had children, and then they're coming back to the UK. So sometimes half the partnership has got a very good understanding of the UK system and some haven't. And then obviously the third category is that first time to the UK ever, and they need to really start from the beginning. So we do everything from just a little bit of hand-holding at the beginning if you know roughly the route you want to take. But then the most common route is that they're looking for a consultant who to go through the whole advice section from nursery through to university.
I know when it comes, for example, to American schools and universities, I have a picture painted in my mind that's very much been put in there through popular culture references and movies growing up and that kind of thing. Is there a typical stereotype that exists for UK schools and universities? And what is that and what's the reality?
It's a good question. I mean, the mainstream press, and if you were to read that abroad, would paint the picture of an independent school, of the listed building, the green meadows, the bowler hat of the uniform, the sports pitches, all of that type of stuff. That slice of Britain that's used really to export British education overseas. And
And a
that's the
little bit
selling
Harry
point.
Potter, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, some of the schools play into that kind of story. You know, the prospectus and the websites do create that kind of ilk of the boarding houses, the uniforms and the school trips, and it all goes into that slice of Britain that someone maybe in Shanghai or Beijing is going to buy into, that they want to send their kids to. The reality of it is that there are elements of that depending on what type of school you go to. So, traditional schools like Eton, Harrow, just to name two, there's loads of them. In fact, hundreds of great schools of a similar ilk. But once you dig behind that surface, they're actually very modern. The curriculums are modern. The teaching methods are, fantastic, and a lot of the teachers are very young, straight out of college or a couple of years in. So there is a difference between kind of the brand Britain in terms of that education, and then when you get behind the scenes of what they're actually going to be delivering. I think the opposite is also true for when you look at the US system. It's ultra modern, fantastic facilities, and a very different type of education delivery that you would get into in the UK. Both are equally good in their own right.
And what about throughout different parts of the UK? Is the schooling that you can expect in London and surrounds different to north or south?
It is a different type of education, but by that I mean not necessarily academically different. So essentially the stats of grades attained, there are fantastic schools dotted all over the UK, all that feed into the top universities and all command the best teaching staff. So it's not necessarily academically different. What is different is the style of learning maybe, but also the environment. So obviously, if you're going to go to a city centre school in the middle of London, it's not going to be the same delivery as a countryside campus-based school in the middle of in the country where you've got acres and acres of land. Sports is a very big thing, pastoral care, boarding homes. So it's just a different type of personality fit that we're looking for. And that's one of the integral parts of finding a school for someone, that they come into the UK thinking, we really want to we're living in London, we want to go to a city centre London school, but actually maybe their son or daughter is a little bit more creative and wants to have a bit of their own space, and they're much more suited personality-wise to maybe an out-of-city school. So that's one of the challenges of kind of managing expectations along the way.
So say you're an international family without the advantage of one person being from the UK, so you don't have that insight from your upbringing.
Yeah.
What will be laid in front of you, I guess, in terms of the different school types to choose from, and what are some key differences that these families should know?
Sure. So this is probably the biggest question and the biggest longest amount of time we spend with new families when they come to the UK, especially those with no prior knowledge. The UK is a very tough system to penetrate when it comes to the UK education, and it's why it's so daunting, actually. When you've grown up through it yourself, it becomes second nature and it's obvious. But when you're new to the system, you've got questions like mixed or single sex, a day school or a boarding school, city centre or campus-based countryside school, selective or non-selective. You've got prep schools, pre-prep schools, senior schools, or then you've got schools that start at nursery and go the whole way to 18. So all of those questions need answering to bring together kind of a short list, I guess. If you didn't answer all of those individual questions, you'd probably be faced with a list of 40 different schools. It's just not feasible to research each one. So we start really with a family and say, well, where do you want to be in 5 years, potentially, and work our way back and narrow down those options between all of those different questions. I think if you approach it from the beginning, it can be totally overwhelming because there's no real way of saying, well, this school is great at this, but how do you compare it to this if they're two totally different schools? Which is why it's so easy and to sort of get the wrong choice, I guess.
And that future forecasting bit, particularly if you're an international family, you've made some moves already and you're likely to again in the future, that's so important to get right, isn't it?
It is. And I always say to new parents that our job really is to make sure that you don't close any doors that don't need closing right now. And by that, I mean that you can inadvertently close some doors along the way without realizing it. So we always say, well, if you're coming in at, say, 11, so the family are coming with an 11-year-old child, and we say, where would you ideally like to be in 5 or 6 years' time, i.e. university stage? If they say, well, we're looking to go to a US college, then that's a very different answer to say, well, actually, we don't really want to go to university, or we've got military service to go back and do in a different country, or we want to go to Oxford, or we want to do medicine or something like that. Because along the way, from 11 through to 18, there's some big decisions to make, a lot of subjects to be chosen. So if medicine is the course choice, then clearly business studies, English and PE probably isn't going to cut it. So we'll be there to try and advise along the way to make sure that we've got that final goal in mind. Now, that being a barometer of where they would like to be in 5 years, quite clearly from an 11-year-old to 18, 17, things change. So, and that's fine. That's part of it. But what we try and do is try and manage that change so it's not too much of an abrupt surprise when that change happens.
I was going to say, when you ask your 11-year-old, what they want to do, it's going to look completely different to, as you said, 5 or so years later and how they've developed and formed their views of what they'd like to do and the direction they'd like to take in their academic life.
Yeah, we generally try and phrase it in terms of not what you want to do as a job, but we say, where are your interests? So if they're science-based, then that opens up a raft of different types of careers that in our minds, we're kind of thinking, okay, this may be an option down the road. And the types of schools that we'll look at, maybe really nice science labs, or if they're more sporty, then it makes no sense for them to go. For instance, we had a family that had 2 boys that competed at national level for a certain sport. And it would have been completely insane to send them to an inner city school that had to hire their own sports pitches, because quite clearly that was going to be some level of interest in their lives going forward, whether it's business with a sports angle to it. So we try and angle our school choices and university choices to about where they're going to be in the future, and also talk to their parents, because if they're super academic parents with very professional careers, It could be the case that they're going to follow in roughly similar footsteps, or the parents have got very strong ambitions for them, which then opens up another kind of managing expectations exercise where we've had families where very ambitious parents, very hung up on branding, really want that brand on the CV of their child and really only want the best for their child. However, after an assessment, maybe an initial call and some review of their reports, it's quite clear that actually their child isn't that way inclined. And you can't really push, because you put a student into a very academic hothouse and they're not going to be happy. And our job is to really make sure that they're in an environment they're going to thrive and be happy in long term.
I was listening to another expat podcast the other day. The American mom was explaining the difficulty she had in passing study and revision advice to her child who was going through the French schooling system, because she was taking one approach when actually the teachers expected a completely different approach as a measure of success. How does the English schooling system typically approach studies, and how can this surprise families if they're not used to the expectation of teachers in the UK?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, really, because I think every family that we've worked with obviously have been brought up a certain way and they've studied in a certain way. So invariably, they're going to try and encourage their child to study in a similar way. Now, this practice changes all the time. So the way UK schools generally encourage study is a mixture between self-study, demonstrating interest, pursuing your own interest, and there's a mixture of hands-off and then obviously the stick side where you've got to do this and get through an exam. And I think some of overseas families effectively, when they're coming from a different education system, it's very much more autocratic, or the other way, it's very more laid back. So matching those two with a day school especially is tricky, because when a student's at a boarding school, they're kind of on their own there. They're in the environment and they're looked after, and they go with the flow of that environment that they're working in. When you've got one environment at school and then you go home and you're being told to do a different thing, that's where kind of a conflict can arise. But generally, we've not had a problem with that.
Steve, I really love the idea of a boarding school, and I grew up reading Enid Blyton books and found it also fantastic to picture in my mind. A boarding school compared to a day school, are they the sort of schoolings that really suit different personality types, or, are they encouraged for any kids?
They are very, very different, obviously. From what I've seen from and spoken to so many people in the industry, they do suit different types of personality. The counter to that is that I think any personality can do well in them. You just need to be very careful on which school you pick. I mean, the stereotype of a boarding school personality would be very independent, extrovert, confident, social, all of those types of traits. But the truth of that is that those traits come out once they've been to boarding school. Not necessarily, you don't go to boarding school with that personality at 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or 11. So, there is an argument there that kind of environment can bring out those traits later on. However, we also have had students where they've been in a boarding school environment and hated it. They just were not that way inclined, a little bit more homely, I guess, wanted to do other things outside of school. And their parents brought them out and put them into a day school. And I think similarly, students at day schools feel a little underwhelmed sometimes if they're really independent characters and want to go and push and do different things. They've actually approached their parents and said, we really want to leave and go. It's a very mature thing to do for, say, a 12 or 13-year-old to say, we really want to go to a boarding school and cut loose the parents. So we've seen both of them, really. And we kind of always introduce a bit of both onto our shortlistings if the parents are open to it. Now, a big trend that we're seeing actually over the first couple of years of working on school placements a long time ago was that it had to be boarding. Even for the domestic parents, they really loved that boarding experience, maybe because they were boarded when they were at school. But actually recently, the last 2 years, a lot of domestic parents don't want to board, and the day schools are becoming much more competitive. I think the fee levels are becoming a bit of a problem as well. Boarding schools are very expensive. Now, obviously, an overseas family, you kind of haven't got a choice. You either send your student to a boarding school or you're relocating back to the UK and then you're going to buy a house and go to your school. So there is definitely shifts in perception there. And some boarding schools are starting to accept day students. I think it's probably a sign that there's not enough demand for the pure boarding experience.
We haven't talked fees yet. What do international families need to be aware of when it comes to putting their children in the UK education system and how much it costs?
Yeah, it's not a small undertaking. I mean, most boarding schools for a normal three-term year would be between 35,000 pounds per year, and that's really a starting point. That we always say add on another maybe 10 to 15 on that, because you've got uniforms, school trips, various other bits and bobs that crop up along the way. And then if you're joining at 11, 13, you've got through to 18. So for one student, you're looking at maybe £200,000 or £300,000 investment there. It is a product and service that families are buying, and no wonder the buyers are getting much more discerning and know what they want out of their school, which is why there's a heavy investment going on of those fees back into the schools to create the best facilities, very competitive within schools to attract the students. But then you multiply that, you've got 2 kids or 3 kids, it does become very costly financially for parents.
Steve, if you're an international family and you have the money to pay, for example, for boarding school or a very good school, does your child still need to sit some kind of entrance exam, or do they just get in?
No, they will have to sit entrance testing 95% of the time. A lot of the top independent schools are selective, so academically selective, and the main entry points that we give as an overview of the British system are 7 and 8 years old, 11, 13, and then 16. And generally, there'll be an entrance test at every single point of those. So if you started at one school and it was a through school, or we call them a through school, all the way through to 18, then maybe there wouldn't be an assessment throughout that course. But generally speaking, parents will move at 11 or 13 through to 18. So most children will have at least one set of competitive examination prior to getting into a school.
We talked earlier about how important it is to make decisions about schools based on, a little bit of forward planning. What can happen if you don't plot out properly or well enough, or you don't consider well enough where your family is going in the world in the future, or where your child might choose to study in the future?
Well, what we outlined before is a perfect scenario. Now, most families, obviously, their circumstances change all the time. So it's not always possible to plan perfectly where you're going to be in 3 years' time or 4 years' time. So these are problems that we're constantly seeing. And to be frank, if we didn't have those problems, we'd be out of a job. So really, a lot of the cases that we find, parents are approaching, and for various reasons, they've had a circumstance change and they're moving into the UK, or they've left it a little bit too late. There's a million and one other things going on. So the perfect scenario is that you think ahead and you want to go to this school, which feeds to that school and then on to that university. But in reality, we do deal with panicked clients. They've missed deadlines. This child hates the school that they're in. They need to leave. They're relocating. They've got a new job. And all of those things add to stress within a relocation. And schooling, remember, is just one element of relocation. There's a million and one other things to do. The reality of it is that most of the time, it's never truly too late, as long as the client's flexible. So if you're coming to us in May and you need a school place for September, then we'll be able to help. It's just about being flexible. You may not get into the school that is on the British brochure abroad, and it's got a 2-year waiting list.
And I guess that feeds into the question of what's the benefit of talking to consultants like yourselves when you are looking at where to put your child in the UK education system, and compared to doing your own research and getting a lot of internet tabs open and making your Excel sheets and figuring it out for yourself.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think collating the information is so valuable. The method of assessment of all of those, because when you come into a UK and you're looking for, say, a short list of 4 or 5 schools, you're probably going to look at maybe 15. It's so difficult to decipher what that school is actually like, and not what the website tells you, because the website will tell you that it's the best on every single website. And what is it actually like? What's the name of the admissions person? What type of student do they like to recruit? But B, what do they sort of produce at the end? What type of student comes out the other side? Where are their strong points? What did the last inspection say? Would we recommend it for your student, having seen their reports, having done an assessment, having seen you and your family together in your home? And those are all of the different things that a consultant will be able to make an evaluation and put together the right set of information. Now, ultimately, the family will make the final decision from an agreed shortlist of where we feel that they should go and they'll thrive, because ultimately their child is going to go to it. So they need to make that final call. But the value of having someone by your side to go to an open day, make sure you're asking the right questions, preparing to meet the head, really is invaluable for some parents. And we've had some clients that haven't got into schools prior to coming to see us, and they really didn't sort of understand the dynamics of an open day, for instance, or the application forms. They're very convoluted sort of forms and application processes to go through, registering for entrance exams, that type of stuff. So yeah, it's a long process, but with the right help, you can get it down to a nice fine art.
And having that insider alongside you to, as you say, make sure you are asking the right questions when you do tour a school and hit the right deadlines is so important.
Yeah, it is. And the open days can be very well choreographed. You know, there's generally some shows happening, sports events, classrooms, but you get to learn a lot more about the school when you go one-on-one with the registrar. We get a last-minute personal tour, and you see a school actually working, and it's like a little community operating, and you get to really walk around and see how that works without the choreographed open day going on. So
yeah, it's a bit like the difference between an open for inspection, house open for inspection, and when you do a drive-by in the middle of, of the night.
Yeah, there's no cakes hanging out when you're just driving by.
When it comes to education consultants like yourselves, are all advisors the same?
In a word, no, they're not. I mean, I'm kind of biased to say that, aren't I? However, they really aren't. It's not a regulated industry, and actually, there's a lot of different types of practice going on within that market, and you see a lot of agents and consultants who are kind of call themselves consultants from overseas, and what they're really doing is representing a family and putting them into a school without really ever seeing the school, ever seeing the parent, and ever really considering whether it's the right fit for that child. And actually, on that note, the type of model that we're working in, we're a completely free service for schools. We're a school partner. We don't accept any commissions or payments in exchange for a student attending their school. And that seems obvious, but it's a very important point, because the vast majority of consultants and agents do. And there is an inherent conflict of interest there. That if you have a very bright student coming in from Dubai, for instance, an expat family, and they have offers from 3 different schools and with 3 different commission levels, then quite clearly there's going to be a conflict of interest there to place them into the school where the commission is highest, not necessarily the best school for that child. So we take away that conflict, and ultimately it isn't really concerning us where that child goes. Our main points of contact are that as long as he is happy or she is happy and the parents are happy and they stay there for as long as they want and they're happy and thrive, we've done our job and we've taken away that conflict of interest. A very important point we find is a common recurring problem that unfortunately we can't always rectify because it's sometimes too late, that when you've got 2 children, or even if you've got 1 children moving into the UK, start as far in advance as possible. Now, I know we touched on the fact that all circumstances change, and that is part of life that you can't really alter. But if you know that you're moving at some point in the future, we always say try and engage with an advisor as soon as possible, because it puts you in front of the queue and you can get as much time. And gradually, the closer towards entry time, the more stressful it becomes for us and for the family, and importantly for the child. So start as early as possible is my leaving part of advice.
That's it for today. If you want to continue the conversation about the UK school system, head over to expatfocus.com, follow the links to our UK forum or Facebook group. For more on educating children abroad, check out our episode with Rebecca Grappo of R&G International Educational Consultants. If you like what we do, please leave us a review, and I'll catch you next time.